back. So in the previous video, we briefly reviewed what are Azure functions, right? And in this video, let's go ahead and create a sample Azure function on the Azure portal, okay? But before we do that, let's go ahead and create a similar function in Visual Studio, and let's see how we would create a basic function in a traditional environment, right? We're not going to actually host the function somewhere, but let's go ahead and create a sample function, okay? So and for this purpose, I'm just keeping it very brief, right? We're going to build more functions in the later stage, in the later sections, where we'll do the real life scenarios with the LogicApps, right? So right now, what we want to do is we want to take an input, a string as an input, right? And that would be called a name parameter. And as soon as the user inputs the name, we will return another string that welcome XYZ name, right? So it's a simple function, but if you worked with functions in any kind of language before, you would realize that this is in a nutshell, this is what a function does. Then you can have, a numerous lines of code inside that and have run business logic that you want, right? But in a nutshell, your function is something that would either take some kind of input or not take an input and return some kind of output, right? Let's go ahead and check how we would do this in a Visual Studio. So I've already created the function for you. Let me open the Visual Studio, and I've named this project Hello Functions, right? This is like Hello World, the first function that you build, right? And here is the code. As you can see, it's a very basic function, right? We just want to test how Azure functions work, right? So this is the traditional function. This is not the Azure function yet. We'll build that right after this, right? So what I've done is I've built a console application using Visual Studio, right? And I'm asking the user to provide the name as an input. And once we receive that name, I'm storing that name input in this string variable name, and then I'm calling this return welcome function, right? So I've built this return welcome function code here outside of this main branch, right? So here's the function. Again, this is very basic function. What this does is it would take this name as an input, right? And then we'll see if it's not null or empty, right? So if it has some kind of value, then it would return the message in the welcome your name, welcome to Azure Functions. So this is a function, and it pretty much works the same way in any kind of programming languages. The syntax might be different, but this is how functions work in almost any kind of programming language, right? So this is the function, and this is what we want to do in Azure, right? So let me quickly go ahead and debug or run this function, and let's see how this is going to work, right? So let's debug that. It's going to ask me for my name, right? That's the input of the function, right? So let's see. And here it's asking me my name. Enter your name. That's my name, and there you go. So the function return the message saying welcome Mayur, welcome to Azure Functions, okay? And there we go. But this is, we've just done the coding of these functions, right? Now let's assume we want to build an API, and that API would call this function behind the scenes, right? So now we're looking at much more than just a function, right? You need to now code for the API. You need to create the bindings for that API. Then you need a server. You need a physical or a virtual server where you can host your API, right? So now we're looking at much more things after creating the function, right? So this is what your business wants you to do, right? You've done that. But then in order to host this, you need to do a lot more things than just writing a code. So let's go ahead and see on Azure Portal how this would work, right? So I have the Azure Portal open. You can go to portal.azure.com, right? And then because we are creating the functions for the first time, it's going to ask us to create some additional things like the function app and storage account, and there are a couple of other things, right? So let's see. I'll tell you as we are creating them, right? But once you create the first function, the second time onwards, all you do is create and just add new functions to that app, right? So in the search bar, I can type functions, and you can see this function app, right? Let's click on the function app. And because there is no function that we've created so far, it doesn't show us anything, right? Let's create the function app. Now, function app basically is a collection of, it's an aggregated functions, right? So you can create multiple functions app, based on the requirement, based on the way you want to segregate the various functions that you would eventually create. So we're going to create the first function app. We'll select the resource group CI101, and let's give it a name, learn 360.azurewebsites.net. That would become the name of the function app, right? And then it gives you the option of either writing the code, or just using the code, or publish them in the Docker container, right? So we'll just keep it as a code right now, but once you know more about this, you can play around with the Docker. It's amazing how things work with the Docker container, right? And then here is the runtime stack that it asks you to choose from, right? So you can see .NET, Node.js, Python, Java, PowerShell core. There are all these kind of languages you can use to build function and host in the Azure Function app. So for our purpose, we're just going to select the .NET Core for now. And then version also, it gives you the most latest version available right now. So let's choose 3.1. And the region let's select East US, because that's what we've been using for all of the other LogicApps and ServiceBus, right? So let's keep it same across all of the components that we use. But in the ideal world, you would choose the region that's closest to your customers, right? Review and create. So right now we're creating the function app, and this is, you only do it once, right? And then you keep on adding functions to that. So when you're ready to add more functions, you don't have to create the function app again, okay? Let's wait for it to complete. Let's create. Now it's going to create the function app, and it's going to deploy that for us, right? And once it's ready and deployed, it would give us the message that it's ready, and we can go to that resource and start building functions, right? So let's wait for the deployment to complete. Okay, so it's ready. Let's go to the function app. So this is our function app, the one that we just created, right? And inside that, let's go ahead and click on these functions on this left panel, right? So let's go ahead and click on functions. So there is no functions right now, right? Let's go ahead and create our first function. So I'll click on this add button here. This allows us to create the functions using the portal, right? And then it also asks you, whether you want to use the Visual Studio or any other IDE to create this function, right? So I'm just going to choose the portal option. So we can write the code right here in the browser, in the Azure portal, right? So let's go ahead and do that. And then it's asking us to select a template, right? So these templates would have some of the basic parameters set up for us already to get us started, right? So let's select what are these all templates, right? And basically templates define the trigger, okay? So you don't have to manually define your bindings, right? So the first one we see is the HTTP trigger, right? So if we want the function to be available as an API, right? We want that to be an HTTP trigger. That's what we wanted to do with our Visual Studio Code, right? And then there are multiple other triggers, right? Timer trigger, Azure queue storage trigger. So if you receive a message in your queue storage, you want this function to get triggered, right? So there are multiple triggers available here. You can go through them. There are plenty of triggers available, right? So let's select the HTTP trigger for this demo, right? And the name of the first function, I'm going to give it hello functions, right? And the authorization level, I'm going to keep it anonymous for now, okay? And then let's add this new function called hello functions. Okay, so it has completed the functions for us, right? So let's see. On the left hand side here, you see these four options, right? The first one, where you can actually see the code and write the code and also test this function. Let's go ahead and click on that, right? So here's the sample code it created for us, right? And it does the same thing basically. The sample function takes your name as an input, okay? And it returns this string, hello name. This is the string basically that would be returned out of this function, right? And then if you want, you can click on this to test this function. Okay, let's see what are the other options before we go ahead and test this, right? So in the integration, basically you can define the bindings, right? So the bindings that we've chosen for this function, right? So it can, right now it's triggered from the HTTP request, and then the request would call this hello functions function, and then it would give you the output, right? You can define multiple inputs here. So if you want to have another trigger, right? So you can click on this add input and you can add another trigger to the same function, okay? The monitor is your basically monitoring of how many times your functions has run, if there has been any exceptions to your functions, whatever is going on, anything related to your functions monitoring is available in this window. And then the keys, basically, if you want to use this function, if you want to call this function from outside, you might need to use these keys. So you can create the key here, okay? So let's go ahead on the code and test option, and let's see what exactly this code does, right? This is a .NET Core. It's a very straightforward syntax. So if you are familiar with any other programming language, if not .NET, right, you should be easily able to understand this syntax. But assuming that if you're familiar with any other programming language, you would choose that in the stack it asked us earlier, right? So it would be your choice of programming language. But being a .NET Core, let's quickly review what this function does, right? Here's the async method, the first one, right? Because it's going to wait to get the response, right? And then it's also logging that the HTTP trigger function processed a request. So this is a log that it's auditing, right? And then we are from the query of this API, right? There is a parameter called name. So we are basically fetching out the value of that name parameter, okay? And then users can also choose to pass the name parameter as part of the body, right? So in the API, you can use the variables in the URL itself, or you can pass as a body, right? So if it was passed as a body, then we are retrieving the name from the body itself, right? So in either way, in this name, we would have the actual name passed in that parameter, either as a variable or as part of the body. And then here we're creating a response message, right? The response message is something that will be returned back as to the caller of this function, right? And we can see again here that it's returning, hello, and then your name. And here this HTTP triggered function executed successfully, right? So if you want to return anything else, you can use, change this, right? Let's change this to what exactly we had here, right? And welcome to Azure Functions. Okay, hello name, and let's select this and replace with welcome to Azure Functions. Okay, and we're ready to save and test, right? So let's click on test run. So here it also gives you, a nice little tool to test your functions right here. Okay, so it's using the HTTP post method, right? And in the query parameter, I can pass the name as a parameter, right? Or I can use the body to pass the name parameter. So here, let me pass my name, okay? And then as soon as I run, it's going to trigger this function, okay? Let's see what happens. Hello, Mayur, welcome to Azure Functions, right? So this is the response that we already received out of this function. And let's close this test window, okay? And this is it. That's it. You don't have to host this anywhere. You're ready to use this function. So wherever you want to use this function, use this button to get the URL to your function. Let's see what happens, right? So the default key is already part of this URL. Let me copy this function URL, okay? And I'm ready to use this as an API. Okay, let me call this function from the Postman tool, right? Let's see what happens. I'm going to create a new request. This is a post method, and let me paste the function URL here, okay? And in the query, I'm going to pass in the name, and the value I'm passing is Mayur, okay? So you can see here, instead of body, I'm passing the name parameter as a variable in the URL itself, right? So let's go ahead and send this. And there you go. Hello Mayur, welcome to Azure Functions. Right? So you can have as many parameters as an input, right? You can have a huge body as an input to this function. You can do n number of things with your function. You can call a SQL database and get some, lookup done in the SQL. You can insert some database. You can call other functions from within this function. You can call other API from within this function. But the beauty of this Azure function is that now you're done. You don't have to worry about creating your own bindings. You don't have to worry about managing your infrastructure, hosting your API somewhere, building your security mechanism. Nothing is required. This is all you have to focus on, building your business logic using your code, right? So I hope you're finding this as exciting as I'm finding it, right? Because I've already used this function over the years a lot of times, and I know the beauty of these functions, right? It saves a lot of development time. It saves a lot of testing time, right? A lot of things has already been taken care for you as a developer, right? So I hope you are enjoying this Azure Functions section, and make sure you follow the steps and you also create your own sample functions, right? If you have any existing code with you, right, that you already created previously, try and maybe use the similar code in your Azure Functions, and let's see how it behaves, right? Try different triggers, right? Try time trigger, for example, if you want your function to on a scheduled basis do some job, right? Then use that timer trigger, right? And play around with the functions. It's really easy, and once you start once you start creating these functions, you would realize that how efficient it is to do this new development with the Azure function, right? And in the next video, we're going to use this exact same Azure function, but we'll call it from the LogicApps, right? Because LogicApps is the main workflow mechanism in the Azure, and in the ultimate exercises that we'll do will be the main component would be LogicApp, right? That would be the central pillar, if you call it, right? So we would create a LogicApp, and then we would call the same function that we just created from the LogicApp, right? Stay tuned. See you in the next one. Thank you.